Hi guys, it's Andy McDonald, physio and strength and conditioning coach, and welcome to the Informed Performance podcast. On today's show, I have Tyler Williams, the Director of Sports Science and Assistant Athletic Trainer to the Los Angeles Rams NFL team. In this episode with Tyler, we will be discussing return to play testing and building your own AMS system and more. This episode has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of ForceDecks, the world's fastest, easiest and most powerful dual forceplate system. ForceDecks can help you to analyse neuromuscular strength, performance and imbalances in your athletes. With an incredibly simple setup and intuitive software, ForceDecks automatically detects over 15 common forceplate tests and analyses them with a single click, helping you to collect quick and accurate insights on your athletes. To learn more, head over to our sponsor, volperformance.com. You're listening to the Informed Performance podcast with me, Andy McDonald, and here is today's guest, Tyler Williams. Tyler, welcome to the show, mate. It's fantastic to have you on.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for reaching out and having me on the show today. I really appreciate it.
No, pleasure. Just to begin with, mate, would you be able to outline your kind of your professional story and your professional background, just so we can kind of get some context for where you are now and how you got there?
Yeah, grew up in the Midwest. Growing up like a lot of people in sports, love sports. Everything from playing to watching to just reading, and quickly realized as I started playing at a little bit of a higher level, physical limitations. 5'11", 165 pounds doesn't get a ton of looks unless you just are unbelievable in a certain skill. So with that, I attended Truman State University and went through their exercise science program with an emphasis in athletic training. So it really drove a sports medicine avenue first in the athletic training. And then from there, in undergrad, got an internship with the Rams that turned into a full-time position. And after that, my boss, our VP of sports medicine, Reggie Scott, really helped propel my career and push me into a sports science avenue around probably 2012 to 2013. And then got my master's in performance and injury prevention, and really transitioned into like a dual role at that point between a medical lens and a sports performance lens blended together.
So you mentioned your background. How does your kind of role fit into the Rams organization? And what I mean by that is, professionally, who do you have, and how does that kind of department get structured?
Yeah, so starting off as an athletic trainer by trade in the sports medicine department, we're structured in the sports medicine side as with a head athletic trainer, multiple assistant athletic trainers, a couple physical therapists on staff that all kind of have their own unique individual niche that brings something to the table, whether it's manual therapy, rehabilitation, foot and ankle mechanics. But then our performance umbrella structure also has player development, a dietitian, a strength and conditioning department, a mental health component. And where sports science, as I transitioned into that helped kind of link all those disciplines together on a common ground. Just because of the fact that I believe sports science provides an opportunity for all these different disciplines or different languages to communicate together, because as you have all these merging sciences and some of the technologies helping those kind of blend together, people are getting away from silos of departments, which is great. And so if you kind of view it as a 6-lane highway where all those lines are hard yellow lines where people can't really merge lanes, I think sports science offers that opportunity to make those dotted white lines where people can now blend into other people's lanes. And that link is a sports science avenue of, well, if I'm going to measure somebody's workload, I should also probably pair it with what they're doing in the weight room. Oh, I should also probably pair it with our dietitian down the hall. So I think it creates those almost collision communications and gets really a performance department in sync on the same page and really maximizes what you're providing for your athletes.
Yeah. When you're building a department like that, and I guess to some degree you want a good amount of kind of cognitive diversity to problem solve and get new ideas into the fold. how do you kind of, I'm just curious for you guys or for you, do you look for individuals who are, very specialized in their field and their field only, or do you look for people that are maybe more dual credentialed and have got, a variety of backgrounds, or is it the case that you need a bit of both? Some people that are very purist in their field and some people that are more generalist. How do you balance that when you're outfitting a staff?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a book that I just got done reading called The Talent War, and I think it's an absolute home run for somebody who is in a hiring position. And the way we kind of view it here is number one, being a high character person, because the high character is what's going to make that staff gel and function at a high level. But then number two, we kind of try and put it together, even though we're a football performance program, we kind of put it together like a basketball team, right? Like if you have 3 point guards, your team's not going to be very good. You might be very talented within that entity, but you're lacking other things. Like you need that 6th man off the bench that'll just go in and do some of the gritty work. You need a rebounder. You need a shooter. So we kind of look at it like that. Like, hey, in the weight room, we want someone who's phenomenal at programming. We want someone who has some sports science background that can also communicate with me, and we can be aligned and synced in the same page. We want a physical therapist who has some like our PT, our director of rehab, Byron Cunningham, has a good knowledge set in force plates and workload management too. So the crosstalk becomes very easy to understand and becomes efficient that way to how we want to bring that athlete back into play from a return to play piece.
Yeah, because I feel like you used to get these kind of either or imperfect and very kind of polarizing questions, and I probably asked them myself if I'm honest. Where you people think to themselves or question, do you want a specialist or a generalist in a certain department? When actually you don't necessarily have to be either. You can be both, or any combination of within the department.
Yeah, it's funny, just like how we treat our athletes, right? Like you almost have to do a needs assessment on your own staff and say, hey, what are we lacking? For example, we were lacking maybe some foot, ankle, kinematic analysis, or shoe wear analysis, or cleat, orthotic type analysis. And so we have an assistant athletic trainer that kind of spearheads that, and he has some background in working with a podiatrist. So that gives us a piece within our team that we didn't have before. It's funny, even as I got started into sports science, our vice president, Reggie Scott, he's so unbelievable with anatomy and physiology. He is just so elite at understanding how the joint is functioning, how the tissue is functioning within that movement, and how the anatomy is working, and if they have a chondral defect, or if they have some disruption in tissue, he's understanding how to make those points work together to keep that athlete in a safe place. And as I wanted to kind of go down that road, at one point I kind of had this aha moment, like, okay, that's what he does on our staff, very elite. If I also follow that road, it doesn't give us something that we need. It doesn't give us something that we don't have. So that really drove me to, that doesn't make us better as a staff. That drove me to really drive down the road 10 years ago into the blending technology with some sports science concepts into what we do, and give us something we didn't have before, and really bridge a gap.
That's pretty cool. And it's an unusual combination, I feel like, as well. I feel like quite often you see, PT S&C or PT AT, especially in America, which I think is just pretty interesting. Acknowledging that kind of professional bandwidth, how do you personally apply sports science concepts or principles to maybe improve rehab, just hearing your dual credentials?
Yeah, in simplistic terms here, I mean, sports science has probably so many different meanings, especially as of the last 10 years with the vast advancement of technology. And here it's really just, we try and trim everything down to just systematically monitoring and measuring, and then analyzing what we're taking in and implementing a new strategy to create a more effective or efficient outcome. Pure and simple. We kind of call it in our sports science department the McDonald's concept, right? Like we want to do simplistic burgers and fries, but we want to try and do it better than anybody else. I think sometimes simplicity is probably pretty difficult in team sports because of all the different disciplines and different personnel that have to be on the same page. So usually complexity or trying to do something extremely granular is very tough. So that's probably the main overarching concept that we try and drive with sports science ingrained, whether it is in nutrition or strength conditioning or sports medicine. And then really just starting with just consistent measurements for healthy players that can provide us with a baseline or a target if they do get injured. That way we always have a starting point of something to work backwards from to see if they're progressing towards where we want them to be, and that our exercise prescription is getting the proper response that is intended. How do you know an athlete's really ready? And that kind of spurs the why we get into return to play testing. You know what I mean? Like if you're not measuring it and you feel like they're ready based on what you're seeing them perform, and then they get in and they're still at extreme risk in a fresh state, much less a fatigue state, that shows the emphasis and puts the premium on being able to objectify and measure that.
I guess one thing that I feel like it always differs team to team, I don't know whether it's something you can discuss, is like everybody essentially has some form of monitoring and way of profiling athletes, but how often do you profile and how do you integrate that into a schedule? I feel like it's quite a hard thing and different between different teams and leagues.
Yeah, I think with that it's very tough, especially within our sport. Just because you kind of have this mash unit after a game, right? And you go through this weekly rhythm of, okay, we're in full repair mode right after the game, to then prep mode, to then prime, refine, and then strike again, right, on the next game. And then you start that process all over. And depending on how your game gets played, whether it's heavy offense that one week or it just happens to be a defensive game, you have to quickly adapt your strategies for that next week to make sure certain players or certain positions aren't getting way too overloaded or way too overworked outside their norms. So profiling is something that we kind of look at as almost like an 80-20 model. Like, hey, 80% are going to stay within the blueprint potentially of a program. Our top 10% might be a maintenance or enhancement, and maybe our bottom 10% might be a developmental piece. And I would say in season, it's more intentful emphasis probably on your training. And in the off season, where we don't have the games on the weekend, we can actually try to program to get a desired change of that athlete, to where once training camp starts, once that long in season happens and on the field becomes the most important platform, then we are kind of trying to maintain that athlete, becomes the identity, to maintain them at their optimal state for the course of that season and postseason, to where in season we're trying to work on changing that athlete to enhance them as much as possible.
Obviously, in the NFL especially, you've got very kind of regimented stages to the season and off-season and when they begin and cut-off points. Does your kind of, you mentioned simplicity, does your philosophy on how sports science is applied, maybe in rehab or just in general, does that apply significantly through those different stages?
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you right, like return to play for us is a very critical component of the performance structure and the performance program. And I think usually it's kind of something that sits in the backseat and isn't at the forefront. So you really have a lot of investment in a lot of performance programs on assessment, on profiling, on workload management, on injury prevention programs, right? Where I think return to play just isn't as structured of a process sometimes. And it's tough because there are major injuries and you're usually working against time. Players have a lack of confidence because of something unknown that they haven't undertaken before. You have different pain tolerance. You have reconstruction within a joint. You have different healing phases. So, and then you involve multiple different disciplines, everything from sports psychology to nutrition components that affect the different outcome of that injury returning back to sport. So it's such a critical component. And we kind of thought, why aren't we making return to play as structure of a process integrated within sports science like we do everything else? So that's where we started really using everything that we measure and understand our progressions and alter our exercise prescriptions for our guys. Everything from, utilizing biofeedback from forceplates, right? Just getting a player to understand how they're moving and how to control their bodies again, and just putting them on a set of force plates and viewing the screen while they're weight shifting, while they're starting to unload, while they're starting to just brace isometrically, and let them understand that. Because I think sometimes without those measurables, we always say here, you can't improve what you don't measure. And so without those measurables, you might have an athlete that looks a little bit to the eye like he's squatting well and learning that pattern well again. But at certain points of that pattern, if it is significantly different limb to limb, you might not really be training the true intended prescription that you really were trying to get in the first place.
Yeah, and this can kind of apply to the rest of the conversation in terms of sensitivity to your organization. So you only need to divulge as much as you're comfortable and allowed to say. But, you mentioned force plate testing then. There's obviously very basic metrics that most people that have used force plates would be very aware of. Is there any specifics that you gravitate towards that might be perhaps interesting or very useful for your environment?
Yeah, it's funny, and I'll kind of lead off with reaching out to a lot of different colleagues within sports science, sports performance. Everyone has their own little unique niche or flavor. I've learned a ton from strength and conditioning paired with sports science, different personnel in the field. And then vice versa. I tried to reciprocate from a medical lens combination, right? Like I think about at the first point when we started implementing different, just a GPS player tracking strategy. And we looked at, your total volume on field or your intensity, but we weren't as interested in your acceleration or max velocity to where I think a lot of people went. We were more interested in your deceleration mechanics, your deceleration efforts, the total number of decelerations at different phases of practice that you're accumulating, because we know that has a higher cost on the body. And also in those eccentric moments are where most injuries occur. So we were very intrigued with that. And then so we kind of took that same concept and applied it to return to play. So as a guy starts running back on the field, how are we understanding his progression of deceleration, even at an early phase, to a slight progression on field, integrating back into practice, and then at full capacity. And then transitioning over to before the field, taking one step back on force plates, we've kind of developed, from what we've seen, as we get a guy's eccentric capacity back up, his concentric capacity and capability kind of takes care of itself. Like once he's able to control his load, what he then outputs kind of takes care of itself. It's a lot easier to gain those advancements than it is on the eccentric side. And so we've kind of developed this traffic light system at the beginning. So if a guy jumps, we say, hey, his green light is eccentric unloading impulse. So as he starts that free fall, we're looking at limb-to-limb differences from an eccentric unloading impulse. And then we make the analogy with our players a lot, as I'm sure a lot of people do in the field, of vehicles, right? And then our yellow, so it goes from green light to yellow light. And we look at eccentric braking rate of force development. So as he's starting to break that free fall to load up for his counter movement jump, as you're applying those brakes slowly, how does that look limb to limb? And then we also pair that with a kinematic analysis of videoing those jumps. So mechanically, how does he look? How is he handling those forces? And then what does the actual objective number look like? And then our last step is red light. So right when they come to that hard stop before they transition over to then go concentric force production, we look at eccentric deceleration rate of force development and how that looks, again, limb to limb differences. And then our progression is if they can't really unload equally, well, we're going to prescribe certain exercises, certain modalities, certain treatments to correct that. Then we're going to move to the yellow light. We have certain exercises that produce to work on that phase of eccentric braking. And then another step forward, then we'll find different exercises to work on their red light.
Nice, yeah. Keeps it simple.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, completely. I think I think traffic light systems have been used in all sorts of different forms of sports science, but I don't think it really matters what the metric is. They always keep things simple. And you mentioned your gravitation towards simplicity as a department, and doing it well with the Forceplate stuff. If that's given you the kinetics, do you ever use, say, kinematics to cross compare? So things like, I don't know, squat depth, or does that shift it too far away from the simplicity?
Yes, it's interesting. As we started down this road, we were looking at these metrics, and as you would see increases or decreases, you're then asking a more advanced question of why are those increases or decreases occurring? And then we had to go down the road of, actually, his rate of force development went down, but that's not a bad thing because his counter movement depth is greater, right, to your point. And so they're actually loading at a better rate, not as stiff, right? So it's either too slow, too stiff, or kind of just right. So within our eccentric variables, we kind of try and find this honeypot or sweet spot area, if you will, that gives us the best outcome.
Yeah, and I've heard Dave Hamilton speak to, I think it was Rob Pacey's podcast a while back, and he was talking about his use of force plates for looking at readiness rather than just as maybe a profiling metric that you can program for. Do you guys use them as a readiness metric, or does it become more of a profiling tool essentially for you guys?
No, it's funny you bring that up. That's where we started. We started looking at it and using it as a readiness tool week in and week out. And again, going back to simplicity, understanding the players who weren't as ready, can we just implement different recovery strategies based upon that and target guys that flag that aren't ready, implement those strategies, have that come back up. And then while that kind of process is running, we started looking at things in the return to play piece in a more comprehensive approach.
And if collecting the data is one part of the equation, how do you kind of personally strategize the interruption, I guess, like you've got the information, you've got the data, the so what factor, what are you going to do next with it? So, what I mean by that is how do you strategize the interruption of, pulling players off sessions or talking to coaches, communicating? How do you kind of navigate that important part of the puzzle?
Yeah, that's taken some time over years, just collecting years of data, but we try not to pigeonhole ourselves either from one entity of, hey, maybe their neuromuscular readiness from our forceplate jumps is flagging, but maybe on field they're in a good range of their workload on field, and also their weight room metrics are in a good spot, and their subjective wellness scores are good, right? So it's really a collection of all these different avenues of information that kind of go through a filter system to say, hey, this guy is really flagging in multiple areas. Let's dial him back on the field. Or this guy is in a great spot. Let's go ahead and push him. And this guy's kind of right in the middle. Let's go ahead and just maintain what we have.
Yeah, that makes sense. When we when we connected before and we were talking shop, you mentioned you built your own AMS system or athlete management system, which is something I'd love to discuss. And I'm confident most strength coaches and sports scientists have played around with at least Excel for programming and monitoring. But I think in recent years, that's probably been replaced with R or other coaching languages as the hardware evolves. Could you set the scene maybe and detail why you built your own AMS versus maybe going off the shelf without burying any brands that do off the shelf software?
Yeah. I mean, the brands that are off the shelf for an AMS system are all very, very, I mean, let me start over. The off the shelf athlete management systems are very good. We chose probably about 10 years ago to go down the road of building our own. Our organization was already laying the groundwork from a probably personnel department side of how we're keeping all of our data collection and our information in one location. So, and when you say I built it, that is very loose. I built it because I did not build it, but our analytics and web developer in-house did. And gosh, did they do just such a great job. Even 10 years ago, I mean, we just did so much stuff on Excel, which is great, but it just has so many different limiting factors to it of connecting larger databases and getting stuff fast and having it more automated. And then we kind of transitioned to like a bigger system like Tableau or Power BI to make things a little bit more efficient, that have more capabilities than what Excel does and some better visual outputs. And then we transitioned a lot of that to our own athlete management system, which is basically web-based and has all the API connections with everything that we use, and also has our ability to put in manual inputs as well as not just APIs, but manual inputs or data dumps through an Excel. And really the goal of that is just to have a centralized location that enhances that communication between all our different disciplines.
Yeah. As a bit of a scenario, if somebody from another team was to bump into you and ask you about this and say, what are the pros and cons to building your own versus going off the shelf, how would you kind of steer them?
Yeah, I think the way I would portray that is building your own is kind of having a blank canvas. You can paint it however you want. Off the shelf, you kind of have these guardrails, right? That you can say, hey, I would like to have this, and they have to make a global change for a lot of people and a lot of their clients, to where if we find something we know we really want to implement and we know we need it now, we can walk down the hall and have it updated tomorrow. That's very powerful. We also have the capability to leverage a lot of just open-ended data sources against each other, as opposed to just what's structured within the framework of a off-the-shelf. Now, it is a big undertaking. I mean, some of the graphs that we started with 8 years ago really looked like your kids drew it, right, with crayon, and now it's kind of evolved into being very dynamic, where you can print, send, scroll across, and it's in real time, giving you the feedback of the metrics or the measurables. And then we use a lot of those reports to structure presentations with coaches or players. So it becomes an all-encompassing one-stop shop, but it didn't come without headaches. But putting that investment in the front end, we're really living some of the fruits of that labor now.
And kind of, I guess one of the things I always wonder is how smooth was the process in terms of like taking raw data and plugging in all these APIs? Because theoretically it can sound slick, but in reality you've got to just navigate tons of different tools, I'm sure, with your environment.
Yeah, and some of those is more on our data manager side as opposed to mine, but there is still constantly, little things. It's like having a vehicle, right? It's, hey, I got to go get the oil changed, or I got to change the air filter, or, I'm low on brake fluid, or whatever it may be. It's the same thing that happens with, hey, company A changed their API and changed one column, and now the reports aren't coming up. So you kind of have to troubleshoot it. So having your own athlete management system does come with a few of its own headaches, but you do have control of your headaches as opposed to relying on a third party.
And as it kind of pertains to American football, or maybe the Rams, if you're allowed to say, how did you kind of break down the needs analysis, or how did you structure your old systems and how you were going to transition them into the new system?
Really, I think from a needs analysis side, we started with what can we affect change with, right? So can we affect change in certain metrics with player tracking, like acceleration, deceleration within practice? Probably not. So let's start with our overall reports that are going to give us a good idea of what that athlete is performing. And are they performing above or below their norm? Or we're starting to look at some of our trends of on-field workload to say, let's put these easy, digestible visuals together that a clinician can understand, that a strength coach can understand, a sports scientist can understand, to a coach, to a GM, right? It should be a common language. It should be a one voice, one message approach. And I think that's powerful. It's funny too. And I think everybody goes through this, but there are some times where we're printing off some of these slick looking reports and handing them to players to utilize over a break, right, of how to prepare for the next upcoming phase of training. And you go back and look and you're like, man, that was so good, but gosh, looking at it now, it's so confusing. It's way too much. And you just learn, I think, as with experience and advancement, you learn how to take a lot of information and really refine it down to as simple as possible, because that's the most actionable.
Yeah, kind of what have been the most meaningful parts or meaningful ways you've been able to communicate the data to players or coaches? Because I feel like sometimes you can go into the weeds and spend hours or days developing a certain part of it, or graphic or technical part of it, and then it can be really easily overlooked. I guess, what have been the most effective or the most meaningful parts of it when you've expressed it to others?
Yeah, I think some of it's matching it up with, again, you touched on needs analysis, understanding what that athlete needs for this sport, for his position, and then him specifically to be successful within that position. Is he a pass catching tight end, or is he a 3-down tight end, or is he more of a run personnel tight end? Well, all three of those tight ends in that one position all have different needs that are going to make them successful. So taking those needs and understanding what can bridge the gaps to make them the best player. Now we're working backwards and putting together a holistic approach of all these measurables and putting it on a presentation format and delivering that to the player. And whether they're able to consume all of it or pieces of it, a big component of that is gaining player buy-in with that presentation. And they don't need to know all the nitty-gritty granular details within it, but giving them that information, because it is their information, providing that to them, letting them take that in, and giving them the strategies to say, here's now what you use this information. Here's how we're going to bridge this gap. Here's how we're going to make you better in area A, B, and C. And giving them those take-home strategies, I think then when you implement them, the intent and buy-in from the athlete really drives your performance-driven culture.
Yeah, and one of the questions I've asked a few guests in the past, especially in American sports where the players have an off season, is the players can kind of go into a bit of into a black hole from your perspective, where you don't necessarily have them in the off season. They might be with home trainers or trainers around the States or wherever they kind of gravitate towards. How do you kind of can you kind of keep them on the grid or on your radar with the athlete management system when they disappear to their private trainers and places?
You can a little bit, depending on what mobile measurables that you can sync in with it. For example, I know like Team Polar Pro from a GPS side, they have player tracking watches, right? That measures how far you're running. Different. You can set your velocity zones. You can set some of your workload. They have a what I'd call a nightly recharge type metric, and that can sync in with your Team Polar Pro system. If the athlete wants to divulge that and share that with you. But other than that, it's very limited. A lot of it is, kind of that old school call and check in. How are things going? What are things that aren't going well? What are things that are going well? What issues are you having? And pair that up with what you know of that athlete from your history with them, and giving them some guidance. But there's some times we kind of understand what they're producing if that trainer has a velocity-based tracking device that they use within their program, and we can kind of gauge where they're at. But that's a very difficult hurdle that we have not necessarily figured out all the way to this point.
Yeah. Well, probably you and everybody else, I'm sure. I think that's just the nature of
that's a tough one.
the nature of the leagues out here. We'll kind of inevitably have some younger listeners or fresher listeners, I guess, in whatever retrospective that field they're in, tuning into this episode, and who are probably always going to be curious about how you get into the league or how you get into the team. And I guess one of the things I've always noticed with NFL staff, especially ATs and strength and conditioning coaches, is they've done X number of internships at different teams before getting into their roles. I guess, when you're looking for maybe a slightly younger member of staff into one of the roles, how do you recruit them? What do you look for? Is it the case that you want the internships, or how does kind of the desirability factors play into it currently for you guys, or maybe for the league?
Yeah, I think we'd be looking for somebody who is number one, passionate about their field, that wants to be in pro sports, that wants to gain some experience at a young age. I mean, that's kind of how I started. I got in the door, and I did 3 internships here with the Rams before I even got a seasonal internship, and then that turned into full time. Right, so it just was one of those things where I sent my resume to all 32 teams, and those 4 to 5 years of internships gave me priceless experience to then help me excel and gain that full-time position. So I think too, nowadays, just being a younger professional getting into the field, really looking for people who have a wide range of skills, not just are centrally focused on, hey, I can do athletic training really well, or I can do strength conditioning really, really well. How are you with technology? How are you with Excel? How are you with Tableau? How are you with just almost conceptual process learning? Is that range cover a broad spectrum of athlete performance, not just specific to your field? So you can kind of wear multiple hats.
That's really useful, and I think there'll definitely be listeners who are at that current stage and they're trying to map their route into the league or into a team currently. So no, thank you for that, Tyler. That's probably all we've got time for today. Where's the best place for listeners to follow you?
They can follow me on Twitter at TYWILL4H, or also I'm always welcome to answer any emails at twilliams@rams.nfl.com anytime.
That's great, mate. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time.
Andy, thanks again for having me on the show today. Had a great time. I've always enjoyed listening to Informed Performance and look forward to connecting again in the future.
Big thanks to Tyler for coming on today's episode of Informed Performance. Great to hear his views and insights. And for us at Informed Performance, I think he is our first NFL-based guest. So great to have Tyler on from the Rams organization. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to contact us, see the show notes from previous episodes, or read articles from leading people in performance and sports medicine, then head over to informperformance.com. You've been listening to Informed Performance with me, Andy McDonald. Catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.